Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello everyone, and welcome to BattleWalks, where we are once again walking the great battlefields of Europe. I've got to say, it's a bit of a new season for us. There's battlefield tours actually occurring in real time, which is fantastic. For 2 years, we've done nothing but do virtual tours. But as of this week, we are now actually doing tours again on the battlefield. So it's a wonderful new era. I know someone who's very excited by it is my co-host, Pete Smith. Pete, how exciting, back on the battlefields.
Oh, it's fantastic. I can't wait. And in fact, I'm going out tomorrow. I'm on my way to Paris tomorrow for the start of the Anzac tour. One that always is really, really good fun. It's one of the longer tours that I do, and probably secondary only to the tour that I'm doing with you, Matt, later on in the year, the signature tour. So, yeah, very exciting.
It is really exciting, mate, and it's a little bit of an intimate group this year. Normally we get 30 or 40 people on that Anzac tour, but this year we've only got a dozen or so. But it's great. I'm really gratified to see that so many people are returning to the battlefields. We're getting a lot of late bookings for 2022, which is really exciting. So a number of people are going for 2023, of course, but it's just fantastic to see that people have been waiting for the borders to open and are now heading back over there. So lots of tours later in the year as well, mate.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and I'm quite glad that there's only not the full coach load, because a little concerned I might not be able to remember everything. It's been a long time.
As always, you're being way too humble, mate. I think you've forgotten more about the battlefields than I'll ever know, but it's just going to be great. Obviously, they're in great hands. We look forward to a report. You'll hopefully do some recording while you're actually on the ground about what's happening in Anzac Day. So we can look forward to that. I'm really jealous that you're back on the battlefields, mate. I won't be back until September, as you said, on our signature tour, but it's going to be exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the actual Anzac service at Villers-Bretonneux, the dawn service, because it is going to be a dawn service. There was it took a little while for them to announce what they were going to do, but it's going to be a full dawn service as normal. Numbers are looking like between 800 and 1,000 people, I'm hoping. So it'll be a fair number there. So yeah, it should be really good fun.
Well, I should say to everyone listening, if you do want to get over to the battlefields and you're keen on a trip this year, it is probably one of the best times to go, just because the numbers are down. They just are not the crowds they normally are. Whether you're talking about Gallipoli or the Western Front, you're going to have mostly the place to yourself. So it is a good time this year to be heading over and walking that ground. But Pete, it's just great that people are coming back over. I know it's what you and I love doing more than anything else, is getting out walking the ground.
Oh, certainly. And it's been a long, long time before I've been able to look at the diary and think, it's starting to look like the old days. So, yeah, it's great.
Well, of course, we're not just walking the ground in an actual sense. We're also still doing it in a virtual sense. We're going to continue to do BattleWalks podcasts as we carry on, because we've just had so much fun. We're going to have to try and squeeze it in between other things, but we will find the time to do it. So thank you, dear listener, for tuning in once again. It's exciting to be out walking the ground. And also something exciting as well is we've launched our subscription program. So if you want to join us for bonus episodes and for ad-free listening, you can now do that as well by simply subscribing. I'll put a link in the show notes to Acast Plus. But it's a really good opportunity if you want to join us for more than just the regular episodes, to join us for bonus episodes. Become a member. It's only a small fee a month, and you get lots of extra time with Pete and I, and really some extra episodes where Pete and I just really chat as we would over a beer and explore some of those topics we don't get a chance to during the podcast. So it's Acast Plus, and there's a link in the show notes if you want to subscribe. And we look forward to seeing our valued subscribers. But today, we're doing a great walk, one that I've been looking forward to, Pete. We're getting towards Anzac Day, so it makes sense that we do a Gallipoli walk. But this one's a little bit unusual. This is north of the Anzac sector. We're going to do a two-part series where we're going to walk Suvla Bay, way up in the north. Now, one of the least visited parts of the Gallipoli Peninsula. It's an interesting area, Pete. You and I have done it together, and it's a really fascinating area, quite different to the other parts of Gallipoli, isn't it?
Well, I enjoy it for a couple of reasons, because I have a connection there with one of the Dorset regiments. I lived in Dorset for a while, and one of the Dorset battalions, the 5th Battalion, fought there, so I was always interested to go and see where they fought, and several of the yeomanry regiments, that part-time territorials cavalry had fought there as well. And it's extensive. It's a big area, and it's fairly flat, so you get a good view from almost wherever you are. You're either looking down onto the flat area, or you're looking up to the ridges there. And obviously, in the main, the Turks were on the ridges, so it's a fantastic place to go. Remote, as I'm sure we're just going to be chatting about it. It's a remote place, and you do feel away from everybody else when you're there, and you very rarely see anybody else, in fact, when you're there.
I'll give a very quick overview of the history. This won't be an extensive history. This will just be to give some context to the discussions we're going to have. But basically, in August 1915, after months and months of pleading for more troops, General Hamilton, the commander of the forces at Gallipoli, finally got his wish. And from the UK, they dispatched tens of thousands of more troops. Several divisions came out to reinforce the Gallipoli garrison. And the issue was there was nowhere to put them. Where were they going to put all these troops? So up until this point, they were crammed in at Anzac. The French and the British were crammed in down at Helles. There was literally nowhere to put more troops on these narrow little beachheads. So they decided, well, there's a whole heap of open space further to the north of Anzac. So if we can land this big new force there, they can push inland, overcome the Turks, cut the peninsula off. It was a little bit of a sort of a rehash of the original plan from the day of the landing. And so in the first week of August, they landed this huge force at Suvla Bay up in the north of the peninsula. And this huge force landed. But again, Pete, just everything about Gallipoli, just a disaster. Dithering around and not moving forward quickly enough, vague objectives. And in the end, the force landed and were able to secure the beachhead, but the Turks reinforced the high ground. And once again, exactly the same as Helles, exactly the same as Anzac. The Allies were hemmed in on the beach, and the Turks had the high ground. Just another missed opportunity, Pete.
There are so many kind of oddities and interesting, I suppose, subjects we can talk about, which we almost certainly won't have time to do, so I'm going to just cover a few. Some of the British units that were landing, the British divisions that were landing, were Kitchener divisions. So these are the guys, the pointing finger of Kitchener, your country needs you. These are the volunteers that we normally associate with the first day of the Battle of the Somme. But actually, two of these divisions arriving are Kitchener men arriving on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and this will be the first place they will go into action. And two of the battalions that have always interested me, because they're kind of local to where I come from, the 6th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment and the 9th Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment, will be the first Kitchener battalions to go into action, so the first of those volunteers. One of the other just bizarre aspects of the landings, where most of the men, including the commanding officers of these battalions, had no idea until the last hours of where they were actually going to land and what they were going to be doing. I just find it extraordinary. Also, many of the men were ill because they'd been inoculated just before they got there, so they were struggling from their inoculations as well. Lack of sleep, seasickness before they landed. And they're going to be landing in the dark as well. And you can imagine, we know from the original landings on Anzac Day how difficult that was going to be. Well, this will be, as Matt just quite rightly said, will be no different. It's just unbelievable confusion. And I've been reading an account because I happen to have a couple of collections of letters. As some of you will be aware, I collect documents connected with the First World War. And one of my collections of letters, it's from a soldier who will die just very soon after the initial landings take place. And I've been reading about his battalion, and the commanding officer of that battalion, the only way he was able to even get a slightest idea of what was going on was to manage to get himself on a destroyer near to the coast. He was given the uniform of a naval rating so he could go on deck and have a look and try and be pointed out where they were going and what they were going to do. I just find that just extraordinary. This lack of planning and maps, lack of maps and maps that were either fudged together or were completely wrong. It just goes on and on and on, really.
Just wasted opportunities. It's so frustrating. We won't go into too much detail about the specifics of the Suvla landing on this podcast, but go and look it up and just how muddled it was and how poorly carried out it was. So again, just another lost opportunity. It could have been successful, but it wasn't. The ground is interesting. It's very spread out. It gives the impression of being very, very flat. There's no ridges like there are at Anzac, and there's no sort of rolling hills like there are at Helles. But it's a bit deceptive as well, Pete, isn't it? We've walked across it. There's a lot of little gullies and washaways and little rivulets, and there's the big salt lake, which is the key feature behind Suvla Bay. And, it's deceptive. It'd be hard country to cross at any sort of pace after you'd landed.
And I have to say, most of the times that I've been and walked in this area has not been the height of summer. And of course, we are talking the height of summer. The landings took place on the 6th of August. I just can't imagine what it would be like. It's absolutely boiling, and there's very little shade as well there. And just that's the other thing. And water was always a problem, but yeah, unreal.
So it's a very interesting part of Gallipoli to visit, part that most people don't take the time to, but I'm excited that we're going to be doing it. You absolutely have to. If you go to Gallipoli, you have to see this area as well, because it just tells such an important part of the story. But another part of the story that's really important is while the British were landing at Suvla Bay, the Anzacs and some British troops launched, I don't know how to even describe this, the most overly ambitious, the main part of the assault during the August offensive. When we talk about August offensive, we talk about attacks at Helles, we talk about the landing at Suvla, we talk about the attack at Lone Pine, we talk about the charge at the Neck, we talk about the New Zealanders on Chinook Bear. There's so many elements to it. Again, so overcomplicated. But the key to the entire August offensive was really the area we're going to walk today, Pete, and the attack that took place when the Anzacs and some British troops attacked through the mad tangle of gullies north of Anzac to try and outflank the Turks and get to the high ground. And the high ground is Hill 971, Hill Q, and Chinook Bear are the three hills that the Anzacs were trying to get to. I mean, do you want to just give us the briefest overview of this disastrous advance, Pete?
Well, it is disastrous for the main reason this is done in the dark. There are columns trying to break through land that's not been surveyed properly, and so there's been no patrolling. You've got this horrendous, I don't know what the bushes are, Matt. Unbelievably spiky bushes, very difficult to push through, like a gorse, I suppose, a kind of
spiky
a gorse.
Bastards, I think they're called.
Yeah, that'll be the ones. Yeah, and in fact, there's a pair of my glasses dangling off some of them. I lost some glasses on one of them while pushing through those bushes. But disastrous. We have commanding officers who are drunk as well as one of the stories, and it's just one of those operations that right the way from the start to the finish, because as Matt rightly said, everything is supposed to interlock together, but doesn't interlock together because there's never been a proper briefing explaining to people exactly what role they should be and at what time they should be at certain points. And yeah, it's just truly horrendous.
So the basic thing, again, we won't go into all the history, but look up. I mean, firstly, look up, if you're listening to this, look up a picture from the neck or from Pluggy's Plateau looking north up towards Suvla Bay. There's a lot of photos taken both during the campaign and modern photos. And just note how tangled and complicated this terrain is. Much worse than Anzac. Much worse. Much steeper, much higher, much tougher to trek through. The troops were doing it in the dark, and basically they got lost. They weren't on time. They got lost. Colonel Monash, John Monash, who went on to greatness on the Western Front, this was not his finest hour. And ironically, Pete, he did his worst work on the 8th of August during this advance, which was 3 years to the day before his most triumphant attack on the Western Front. But on the 8th of August here, he didn't go forward to see what was going on. His troops got held up, and they got completely lost. They actually walked up the wrong gully. They were in exactly the wrong place. And it wasn't until after the campaign that Monash even realised that when he'd been giving orders to his troops, they weren't even where he thought they were in the gully. So a complete disaster. The New Zealanders, I should say, did get to Chunuk Bair. The Australians were supposed to get to 971. The British were supposed to get to Hill Q. And the New Zealanders were supposed to get to Chunuk Bair. The New Zealanders did get to Chunuk Bair and had some of their toughest fighting of the campaign up there and weren't able to hold their gains. So eventually were pushed back off the crest. But we're going to walk some of this area, and we're just going to just remember that what a disaster it was. Troops getting lost in the dark. Stiff Turkish opposition as well. Like always, we shouldn't forget that the reason a lot of these plans went wrong was good defence from the Turks. But Pete, an exercise in frustration. I think you described this.
Yeah, and you can see why. I mean, I've actually got lost in the day, never mind in the dark. I just can't imagine doing it in the dark.
It's beyond comprehension, isn't it? Just when you walk that ground, it's the one place at Gallipoli where I can't actually imagine what it was like. Everywhere else you go at Gallipoli, you go, I feel like I'm in 1915, just about. Yeah. You can't at Suvla because what you're trying to imagine is literally tens of thousands of men blundering around in the dark trying to find where they're supposed to be heading. It just the reports from the men were just insufferable about the experience. But that's the ground we're going to walk today. So it's going to be a fun one, Pete. I mean, it's an area that I've done a few times, but it's one that you and I have done once together. It's not an area that is on the regular tourist trail. So it's going to be a little bit of an exploration together as we go along. It is. I should mention we're also doing this walk from my book, Gallipoli, the Battlefield Guide. So if you want to follow along, if you're playing along at home. So we're going to do this in two parts. There's 20 stops on the tour, so we're going to do the first 10. So this will effectively be, we're not quite going to do the Suvla sector in this walk. We're going to do the north of Anzac. We're going to talk about that Anzac attack into the hills, into the high ground in the first week of August. And we're going to talk all the way up to the Battle of Hill 60, which was a monumental battle very late in the campaign. So shall we commence the walk, Pete?
Yes, certainly.
I say walk. I should say, in reality, this is something you're more likely to do in your car than actually do on foot. This first section you could do on foot, but it would be a long walk. It'd probably take most of the day to do it. But you certainly could. I've done it on foot, and it's quite a great adventure. But you might do this in your car as well because there's a lot of sights to see. So we're going to start at the Anzac commemorative site where Anzac Day is held. So go back and listen if you haven't already listened to our couple of episodes we did on the Anzac beaches, because we described the Anzac sector and where the Anzacs came ashore. The first stop on that first tour is where this tour is going to begin as well, except rather than going south like we did on the Anzac beaches, we're heading north. So it's the Anzac commemorative site where Anzac Day is held each year. And Pete, we won't linger too long on Anzac Day, but we should certainly mention it. Just an amazing spot for that Anzac Day service every year.
It is. It's a fantastic location. I mean, it's a fantastic location because it's historic. Obviously, it's just to the left of where the bulk of the Anzacs landed. But it's also a fantastic place to be, to look up and from those beaches and see that height. We've discussed it before, but it is just awe-inspiring when you stand on the beach and you look at where the men are expected to get to, and you realise. And for me, it's always the same. Every time I go and I stand on that beach and I look up, it never feels as it should. It always feels steeper. It feels closer. You feel more exposed as you're on the beaches. It's a great place to start any tour from, really.
So what we're going to do is there's a road that goes along the beach, and this was the area that linked the Anzac and Suvla sectors after the landings in August. And really, this was a pretty major thoroughfare for the men up and back between Suvla and Anzac. And because of that, in the lees of hills and in protected places, they built hospitals and cemeteries. So we're going to see a number of cemeteries as we walk along here. And I think the interesting thing about each one of them, Pete, is they each tell a little bit of a different story. So we're going to start with the first one, which is Canterbury Cemetery, which is just north of the commemorative site, the Anzac commemorative site. A gorgeous little cemetery named in honour of the Canterbury Mounted Rifles. This is an area where a lot of New Zealand troops operated throughout the campaign. And a beautiful little cemetery, one of the smallest, not the smallest, but one of the smallest at Gallipoli. Only 27 graves. So it's just a good start to the walk. And, I mean, there's not a huge amount to say about this cemetery in particular, Pete, but it's fascinating how each of the cemeteries at Gallipoli has their own character, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I think this one's interesting as well, and it's always a clue that's partly medical, is because of the 27, 22 are identified. Now, that's not always common on a lot of the cemeteries on the peninsula, but my general feeling is that when you get named graves, then it's medical, and as we said, most of these are actual medical posts close to the beach, ready for evacuation.
So just a cute little cemetery, 27 graves. Cute's not the right word, but a small and intimate cemetery. So 27 graves, 22 of the bodies are identified, as Pete said. Importantly, this is at the base of Walker's Ridge, the cemetery. So that's Walker's Ridge was the key thoroughfare to the front line for the New Zealanders. So a nice little piece of New Zealand right at the start of the walk. And on the beach in front of the cemetery is the wreck of a barge. There's a few of these scattered along the beach, but there is one here at low tide. You can see the remains of a barge that was left there during the campaign. Obviously, was not of importance to the Turks because they left it there as well. I do love these little wrecks that you find on the beaches, Pete. It's like Gallipoli gives us just a little bit, just a little tantalising connection with the campaign, just to remind us of what went on there.
Well, I think it's also interesting that if you take your swimmers, and I do tend to, it means that if you get an opportunity and you've got the time, if you're doing this by yourselves and you're not rushing to get around everything in one day, then which I would suggest you don't here anyway. You need to spend a few days here at least. Go and have a swim over some of these barges and have a look down. It's great. Walk on the beach a bit. You know, the lumps of SRD jar you can pick up on the beach still. The service rum dilute. As the men knew it, so it's always worthwhile just having a little wander about. And we've discussed this in previous podcasts. If you've listened, I just like that connection with picking something up that is directly from that period, and thinking you're probably the first person to have picked that up since it got broken, if it's a rum jar or whatever it may be, a water jar.
It's a good point, Pete. And people often find ammunition as well around these barges. That were on the barges when they were sunk. So we're going to continue north now, and after 350 metres, we come to the Anzac Village, it's called, which is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission base here at the Anzac and Suvla sector. So this is where the Turkish people who work for the Commonwealth War Graves maintaining the cemeteries, this is their base where they keep all their equipment and do all their work from. And it's closed to visitors, but if you bump into the gardeners and have a chat to them, often they will show you through. And there's a couple of interesting things to see there. The first is a little bit of a special place to me. In the 1930s, when lots of VIPs and distinguished people were visiting Gallipoli and there was very little accommodation, they decided that the Commonwealth War Graves, or the Imperial War Graves as it was then, decided they needed some accommodation on site. And so they built effectively a Tyneside cottage in the Commonwealth War Graves compound. And it's remarkable. It's still there today. It's still maintained. And it has no electricity, but it does have hot water, which is operated by gas. It has a fridge, which is operated by gas, and kerosene lanterns. And it's extraordinary. And you can stay there if you are in some sort of official capacity with Commonwealth War Graves. So if you're a historian writing a book, or if you're doing some research for your PhD, or if you have some specific reason to be there, you can apply to Commonwealth War Graves to stay there. And it's absolutely remarkable, this little cottage. And I stayed there. I've only stayed there once when I was finishing off this book we're actually describing right now, Gallipoli, the Battlefield Guide. But it's just remarkable. It's the only accommodation actually within the Gallipoli battlefield area. And it's just extraordinary. What a wonderful place. And again, a little piece of 1930s Britain in the heart of Gallipoli. Pete, have you ever stayed there?
No, I haven't. I remember going past it. I think we may have driven past it. Sadly, I don't remember walking past, but I remember wishing that I could go and have a rummage around, because it looked just very interesting. And it's always worthwhile talking to the gardeners. I do it a lot here on the Western Front. It's amazing what you can pick up, what information, snippets of information. No, it's one that's on the list for the next time when I'm there.
It's a great place to next time we go, mate. We'll stay there. It's fantastic. Couple of cold beers for the kerosene from the gas powered fridge, and then walk down to the beach. It's really quite special. But another thing that's very special, and we try to take people to on our Gallipoli tours if we can. There's a very unusual grave in the Commonwealth War Graves compound here. It's not. It's unbelievable. It's a Commonwealth War grave like all the others you see across the peninsula, but it's not of a soldier. It's of a horse called Bill. And it's just really remarkable. This is the only Commonwealth War grave in the world dedicated to an animal. And Bill was a whaler, a light horse whaler, who I don't think he was here during the Gallipoli campaign, because not many of the horses were that came with the light horse. But I think he would have served with the light horse in Palestine. And then a number of members of the light horse came back to Gallipoli after the war to establish the graves and to tend to the battlefield. So I think he came back then with an Australian or a New Zealand light horse veteran. And he was there until his death in 1924. And so Bill is buried there under his Commonwealth War Graves headstone. And his inscription reads, Bill, Australian light horse, 1914 to 1924, a whaler and one of the best. Just, Pete, great little story, isn't it?
It is. It's fantastic. It's those little stories that make the battlefield, really.
It's really fantastic. And so we try to take people there when if we can. Craig Roach, our dedicated Gallipoli guide, is very good at he knows all the gardeners, so he usually gets people in there to see the grave of Bill. There's a bit of conjecture. There's a famous light horse called Bill the Bastard, who was famous for being a recalcitrant member of the light horse. I think the two stories have been confused. I don't think this is the same horse. They're both called Bill, but I think they're two separate stories.
Yeah.
But yeah, the grave to Bill, the only Commonwealth War grave of the world to a horse. Just extraordinary. So we're going to leave the Anzac village and continue heading north. There's a couple of hills on the right which are the outpost hills. So they were called Outpost Number 1, Outpost Number 2. They feature in the opening days of the campaign. You often read about them as forming the left flank of the Anzac landings in the opening day of the campaign. Not really much to see there of them today, but you can certainly note them as you head north. But something you will note is just after the Anzac compound is a little white hut. I think it's been rebuilt, Pete. It was burnt down recently, but I think it's been rebuilt yet again for the umpteenth time. There's always been a little hut on this hill, and it's a very important part of the first day of the Gallipoli story. It was called Fisherman's Hut. And on the day of the landing, the Turks were dug in an area around Fisherman's Hut. And the boats that landed on North Beach, not all the boats landed at Anzac Cove, some landed at North Beach. And the fire from here was just horrendous. And some of the greatest casualties in the Anzac sector on the day of the landing occurred for the boats trying to land in and around Fisherman's Hut. And it's always a really important landmark, isn't it, Pete, when you're in this part of the sector?
It is. I was just about to say that because if I remember rightly, it's painted white, so you can see it from quite some distance, and it's always a really good position to point out. I'm right. I haven't been back since there was a fire there, but I've also heard that it had been rebuilt. So hopefully it's as prominent and you can see it as previously, because it's a good landmark. There
was an interesting little anecdote from a couple of days after the landing. Some New Zealanders were in the hills overlooking the beach, and they could see the boats that had come ashore with all dead and wounded, or dead men lying in the boats who'd been killed when they landed. But interesting little quote here just about something that happened in front of Fisherman's Hut. So this is the day after the landing. So this was a soldier called Ross. As Ross watched, he was astonished to see a figure detach itself from the dreadful heap and begin to hobble along the beach. After a few yards, it collapsed. A Turkish sniper had opened. The splash of his bullets could be seen in the water just beyond the man. So this poor bugger had laid for a couple of days amongst the wounded or amongst the dead in all these boats and on the beach. And he was wounded and decided to make a run for it. But Ross, it has a happy ending to the story. Ross and 4 men crept out and dragged him to safety, so that man survived. But just an extraordinary story, Pete. It must have been horrendous to be lie there amongst the corpses of your mates for 2 days in the heat.
Yeah, I suspect he was probably unconscious for a lot of it. He came round and thought, "Where on earth am I?" and then made a run for it. But yeah, horrific. Almost too much to imagine, really, a situation like that.
It's the story of Gallipoli, isn't it? That these key little moments, wherever you stand, we've said this before, because the front lines didn't move very much, because the Allies were there for so long without really advancing, every square metre of ground at Gallipoli has dozens of stories. From the day of the landing throughout the campaign, through August, and then the evacuation. So that's just another one of those little insights into the hell that was Gallipoli. But we're going to continue on now. So again, another hill on the right is Maori Hill, which was occupied by the Maori contingent at Gallipoli. And again, we'll tell more of their story. We talked a little bit about it when we did Walker's Ridge during one of our earliest, I think it was our second episode. We talked about the Second Ridge at Gallipoli, and we talked about the Maoris up there. But the Maori contingent... quite a prominent part of the New Zealand forces. But we're going to carry on, and we're going to come to another cemetery. Now, this one is number 2 Outpost Cemetery, which is, again, just near the outposts that formed the left flank of Anzac. And again, in the lee of these hills, they formed in the early weeks of the campaign, they formed a field hospital. So this is where a cemetery sprung up as well. It's one of those things, Pete, isn't it, that wherever during the First World War you find a field hospital, almost invariably you'll also find a cemetery nearby.
Yeah, it goes without saying, really, and it's one of the sad aspects of medical posts of whatever type, whether it be a field hospital or a dressing station, is that people are not going to survive always, and you need to bury them. So it's very, very common. Sometimes they're so small that they're eventually moved. The bodies are exhumed and moved to a larger cemetery. But in this case, it's large enough to continue and has formed a permanent cemetery. I always think they're quite sad, really, and I often think about the moribund tent when I think about these dressing stations, where the medical doctor who's working there, has to make those life or death decisions if he's going to work on a man that he could normally save, but it's going to take so long that he'll lose the next 3 or 4 people. They will die or bleed to death while they're waiting, so he has to make a decision on a man that will take too long to save. He has to put aside and hope that he'll survive and go back to him when he's cleared the next 3 or 4 and gives himself a breathing space. And it's the nightmares of doctors, really, having to make life or death decisions.
I think in one of our special bonus episodes, Pete, we'll talk about medical facilities during the First World War, because it's such an important part of the story, but one that gets a little bit overlooked in favour of combat troops and infantry and artillery and all the other things that come with a battlefield. But medical services on the battlefield, just essential. Yeah, absolutely. And that term moribund, it's one of those ones that we don't use in, how many times you bring that into a conversation during the week, moribund. But it's, it has those connotations of people just left to die in these areas known as the moribund areas or moribund tent. Yeah, just horrific. But today, number 2 outpost contains 152 burials. So 32 men from New Zealand, 7 from Australia and 3 from Britain, and special memorials commemorating 48 men known or believed to be buried amongst them, and then the rest are unidentified. And like so many cemeteries at Gallipoli, the vast majority unidentified. So you'll see a cemetery that has only a small number of headstones, but note that beneath your feet as you walk in the open areas, many more bodies than are demonstrated by the headstone.
How did you actually sleep last night? If it didn't feel like your very best rest, then you need to upgrade to the softest, most luxurious bedding from Boll and Branch. Their signature sheets are made from the finest 100% organic cotton and get softer with every wash. Millions of sleepers love their sheets, and right now, you can feel the difference for yourself during their biggest sales of the entire year. Hurry to bollandbranch.com to shop their best offers. Limited time only. Exclusions apply. See site for details.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes per detail.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
So yeah, just a nice little spot.
Yeah, I think that's always a sign, isn't it, when you get so many like that they've been using it to concentrate the remains from people in the area as well, and they're brought in. And the longer you have that wait to bring people in, to exhume them from elsewhere or bring them in because they're found lying on the surface or in a gully, then less and less chance of being able to identify them.
And that's really shown here because even the ones that are identified, a lot of the men were killed on the opening day, landing on North Beach. But because they couldn't get to them until the 2nd of May, a lot of the dates, the identified men simply say 25th of April to 2nd of May. That sort of week-long period because they couldn't identify when they were killed. But, of course, most of them were killed on the first day. We're going to head a little bit further north and come to another cemetery. This one's New Zealand number 2 Outpost Cemetery. So the New Zealand equivalent of the Australian one we've just come past. This is a bit of a deceptive one, New Zealand Outpost number 2, because it looks small. It looks like a small cemetery, but there's actually 183 men buried here, Pete. So it's exactly what we were talking about. There's only 33 headstones and 31 special memorials. So it looks like a small little cemetery, but there's actually 183 men buried here. So the scale of the missing soldiers from Gallipoli is, well, certainly on par with what we see on the Western Front, but handled in a very different way to the Western Front.
Yeah, indeed. These special memorials, I've always found them slightly odd as well, because in reality, a special memorial is really that their bodies they don't know where they are. They're either lost within the cemetery or lost close to the cemetery, or when they were concentrated in from a cemetery, they couldn't be found. And effectively, they're missing, really. And I often wonder if the special memorials are really just a tactic to try and reduce the numbers of the missing, because the numbers of the missing for the Great War are so terrible in a way that so many people become missing. We understand that those of us that work on the battlefields and research the battlefields, we understand how many people can become missing. But to the public at home, there was a lack of understanding of how could you lose the bodies of so many men and not know where they were.
It's this cemetery is notable not just for the fact of the burials. I mean, certainly go there and visit the graves and pay your respects. But it's also interesting as the start/end point of a really interesting track that was an initiative that was done maybe 20 years ago by the New Zealanders, because this is the area where the New Zealanders advanced during the August Offensive and successfully reached the high ground at Chinook Bear. And that's where the main New Zealand memorials are. There's the New Zealand National Memorial is up there. the main cemeteries, holding the bodies of men that were killed in that attack on Chinook Bear, and also the New Zealand memorial that records the missing from that offensive. So the key point for New Zealanders at Gallipoli is Chinook Bear. And about 20 years ago, a group of New Zealanders decided that they wanted that the ground the New Zealanders had crossed was not adequately able to be visited. So they built a track which goes all the way from Chinook Bear down and finishes here at number 2 New Zealand Cemetery. And so it's a fantastic track, and you can start it from behind the cemetery and head up. But I'd recommend you don't do that. Start at Chinook Bear and head down. You're walking the opposite direction of the New Zealanders, but it is a tough slog if you're heading up. I've never done it upwards, I have to say. I've only ever done it going down. But it is a remarkable walk. And you head down from Chinook Bear down. There's a fire trail that heads down to the Farm Cemetery, which is a famous site up at Chinook Bear. But you just keep heading down, and they've built steps and railings, and it's a bit of a scramble. You've got to be a little bit careful. I mean, Peter Hart, when he goes to Gallipoli, says, it's just a short walk. So one of the other lessons we can give you about Gallipoli is if you're there with Peter Hart, never believe him when he says it's just a short walk. It's quite a scramble, but it's remarkable. It takes several hours to do. It's not part of this walk. We're not going to do it today, Pete, but absolutely when you go to Gallipoli, do the walk down, it's down Rhododendron Ridge, so in the footsteps of the New Zealanders, and it's absolutely remarkable. And it finishes just behind this cemetery. Have you done the scramble down Rhododendron, Pete?
I haven't. No, I haven't. But I've certainly done a lot of scrambling behind Peter Hart, so I can imagine. I mean, coming down, thankfully, all that was in my mind then, because I know exactly what it's going to be like. There's a swim at the end. That's all I'd be thinking. I can go for a swim at the end.
Well, I had done parts of it. I'd done it in little bits and pieces, but I'd never done the whole thing until my most recent visit in 2019 with Peter Hart, and we did it, and it is quite special. There's dugouts along the way. There's remains of trenches. It's really off the beaten track. It's unique because it is a proper track, so it is a little bit safe, and you know which way you're going. You can't get lost, but it's one of the few places at Gallipoli where you can get absolutely off the beaten track, away from the tourists, but still be safe and relatively safe, and know that you're not going to get lost. So I highly recommend it. One of the best things to do at Gallipoli, and just a real credit again to the New Zealanders. They do things so well on the battlefields.
I agree.
It's just a really great experience. But that track ends just here where we're standing at the cemetery. So we're going to head on now and come to the last cemetery in this chain. This one's on the left of the road, and it's called Embarkation Pier Cemetery. And this really marks the end of the Anzac sector. This marks the dividing line between Anzac and Suvla. And again, we won't. There's obviously a large number of cemeteries here. We won't go into details of each of them. But Embarkation Pier, the Anzacs built a pier that they were using to load and unload troops, but it was very exposed to Turkish fire, and so and it was only there for a couple of days before they stopped using it. But they did then build a cemetery here, again, for hospital units, men killed or wounded between Anzac and Suvla, and particularly men killed in the August offensive, whose bodies were brought down off the hills, were buried there. It's a big old cemetery, this one, Pete, for Gallipoli. 944 burials.
Yeah, this is your typical concentration cemetery as well as initial burials from people that were dying at the time. It's after the war when they're doing all of those clearances of the battlefield where they're trying to find people. They're also shutting down the smaller cemeteries that are not going to be tenable where they are, and they're going to bring them in. And I think 4 were actually brought into this cemetery. So it's one of the larger ones, and it's a clearance cemetery effectively where they've been clearing the battlefield and also closing down smaller cemeteries, so a concentration as we generally call them.
And we should remember as well, Pete, that in the 1920s, the early 1920s, when they were building these cemeteries, Gallipoli was incredibly isolated and transport was a real issue. I mean, still is today, especially this area. So just imagine the 1920s trying to build the gardens and put the headstones in place. They needed sites that were easily accessible. So in a number of places in Gallipoli, they moved small cemeteries and built the permanent cemetery next to a road. But it still would have been a hell of a job to keep these cemeteries maintained, because they did a great job from day one. Imperial War Graves, which is now Commonwealth War Graves, did a great job of putting in gardens, and just like we see on the Western Front, and beautiful headstones, and they're beautiful places. But obviously a much tougher environment in Gallipoli than it is in France.
Yeah. Well, also an interesting time as well, that those, the 1920s were an interesting time, for the Turks. There was almost a civil war going on. There's the war between the Turks and the Greeks, and so Yeah, it wasn't an easy time, and in fact, the peninsula we were basically running the peninsula, so we had that opportunity to do everything at that, just for that small period. I think there's a lot more work, a lot more history that needs to be written about the people that were working on the peninsula in the 1920s, creating these cemeteries.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. For my next book, Krithia, I've been researching the creation of the graves, and the records are very patchy. It's very hard to tell what exactly went on. Usually they would just say, went out today, found 2 cemeteries, concentrated the graves into one spot, without indicating where the cemeteries were or who they'd removed or how many bodies they'd even come across. So it was tough work, and so we should be very grateful to them. Yeah. A couple of interesting graves in this cemetery that I always like to visit. Firstly, Captain Clarence Luxton of the 6th Battalion. This is a bit of a mystery, Pete, and we've solved some of these mysteries on the Western Front, but I'm not sure we'll solve this one. But Luxton was in the 6th Battalion on the day of the landing, was leading a group of men in some pretty heavy and famous fighting on Pine Ridge. Now, Pine Ridge is way on the right flank, way on the on the southern flank of the Anzac line, and Luxton was very prominent there. And he landed, he went straight to Pine Ridge, he led this big fight, and he stayed there for 3 days, or for a couple of days, and then was killed on the 26th of April, so the day after the landing. Yet he is buried in Embarkation Pier Cemetery, which is the most northerly of the Anzac cemetery. So I have absolutely no idea how he would have come to be transported from the right flank all the way to the left.
Well, we have here, it took me a long time to work it out, but we have the similar issues on the Western Front, and generally speaking, and this is why you need some kind of records, and that there obviously will be very little record keeping done on the peninsula during those early years of the clearances and the creation of the cemeteries. But here on the Western Front, it's generally speaking that there are 2 types of people working. There are exhumation teams operating on the battlefields, and there are grave diggers operating on the battlefields, and they're not always in the same area. So if you have somebody digging graves in one area, excuse me, and a body is found in another area, then all that happens is that body, no matter how far it is moved to where there are graves being prepared. So I presume, and that's all you can do, is that this is one of those cases. His body was discovered or exhumed in the 1920s from where he'd been initially buried and was taken to where there were graves, and so it just happened to be on the other side of the battlefield. So that's the only explanation, really, I think. It's
an unusual one. There's another grave that I always stop at here, which is Lieutenant Archibald Aucheloni. I think you'd put Orcoloni. It's a difficult name, Orcoloni. I've never quite got it right.
Those names.
I know how good we are at pronunciation, Pete.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a story worth noting, because Lieutenant Archibald Orcoloni was in the 25th Battalion. He was captain of the 25th Battalion rugby team, which played a few games before the battalion set off for Gallipoli. But he on the 20th of October, so relatively late in the campaign, they were holding the front line near here, and he was shot by a sniper and killed. So that's obviously a sad story. But the family tragedy, Pete, these stories of family tragedy. So his younger brother Bert had been killed on the 8th of August in the same area during the advance on Hill 971. His body was never found, so he's recorded on the Lone Pine Memorial. But there was a third brother. So Cecil, who'd lost both of his brothers in Gallipoli, went on and served. He was awarded the Military Cross and Bar on the Western Front for work in July 1918. And then on the 10th of August in 1918, during the famous Australian advance on Harbonniere on the Somme, not far from where you are there, Pete, he was killed by machine gun fire. So all 3 brothers killed, 2 at Gallipoli and then 1 on the Western Front. Again, those small little tragedies that were repeated thousands of times during the war.
Well, I might pop in and go and see him, because he's buried in Heath Cemetery, and I'm due to go to Heath Cemetery in 2 days' time. So I might pop and say hello.
Fantastic! It's always good to pay the respects by the grave, isn't it?
It is.
The most tangible aspect of the battlefields are the obviously the bodies of the men that still lie there. So that'd be great, Pete. Give him a nod from me.
Yeah, will do.
So I think the interesting thing about Embarkation Pier Cemetery as well is that it highlights the ground that the Anzacs had to cross during that nighttime advance in the August offensive. So the big the big valley opposite is called Çanakkale, as it's known in Turkish, which is the gully that the New Zealanders followed in their advance. So imagine just being here on the night of the 6th of August and seeing the thousands of troops streaming past into these gullies. Just quite extraordinary. This one was quite exposed, and a lot of the New Zealanders were hit by Turkish fire here in the mouth of the gully. So it doesn't look like much, but it's actually a pretty savage part of the battlefield. And this is also the dividing line between the Anzac sector and the Suvla sector, which is now further north. So we're going to keep driving along, Pete. We're going to drive up. The valley is very wide, Çanakkale. And as we drive up, eventually we come to only about 100 metres up, we come to a track that goes straight up the heart of the valley. And we're going to follow that track on foot, or if we're in our car, we can just drive up it if the weather is good. And we drive up, and eventually we end up on a little hill with a little sort of weather station beside it. And this is called Borchop's Hill. Again, not much to look at, just a little hill in the middle of the valley, but was quite prominent during the early part of the attack because it was one of the foothills that had to be cleared by the New Zealanders before they could advance up the valley. And they did it quite cleverly here. It was really the New Zealand mounted rifles were responsible for clearing these foothills, and it's one of the great, probably overlooked chapters of the Gallipoli campaign. What a great job they did! But a sneaky trick here, Pete, where Navy ships every night for weeks in the lead up to the August offensive would shine spotlights on the foothills and then open up a big bombardment. And so they did this every night for weeks in advance of the August offensive. And eventually the Turks got used to the idea that if they ever saw these spotlights come on, that they better put their heads down because seconds later there would be pretty heavy naval fire. And of course, on the night of the advance, they shone the spotlights on the foothills, but there was no naval bombardment that followed. What did follow were the New Zealand mounted rifles sweeping forward with bayonets, and they absolutely overwhelmed the Turks. The Turks were completely unprepared. And in this area on Borchop's Hill, they killed 100 bodies of Turks were discovered after the advance. So it was, a fantastic feat. It was a difficult feat to clear these foothills that the Turks had occupied since the day of the landing. So, one of the great overlooked chapters of the campaign.
Well, it's careful planning, isn't it? It's thinking it through. I mean, it just sounds slightly Monash-ish in that preparation. Very clever. Shine the lights, bombard them, and and then don't bombard and attack on the day that you want to capture the place. So planning and you get success, and that's what we need. That's what was needed, and sadly was not there for most of these advances or attempted advances on the 6th.
So here's a quote of what it was like to be involved in that attack on the foothills in this area. A Turkish machine gun on the spur leading to Walden's Point was responsible for many casualties, and this section of the attack was momentarily held up. Tap, tap, tap went the gun, exacting a heavy toll. I'm just going to jump in there, Pete, and say, isn't that interesting again? It's how machine guns are always described. Tap, tap, tap.
Yeah.
Again, because they're firing in short bursts, as we've discussed before. So tap, tap, tap went the gun, exacting a heavy toll, but a subaltern named Davidson, who gained the ridge higher up, collected a few ardent spirits and with fixed bayonets charged straight down the slope. The dirt thrown up by the angry bullets flicked in their faces as they ran straight for the gun. Down tumbled the subaltern, killed leading his men, but the remnants of the party fell upon the gun crew. The keen bayonets did their silent work, and the gun ceased its death-dealing tapping. That's the New Zealand official history. Very well written. I do enjoy reading the New Zealand official history. But again, just a small little battle, but pretty ferocious in its intent, Pete.
Yeah, and sadly, Colonel Borchop was wounded during the assault, and he died 4 days later. Now, you'd think that he would have a grave because obviously died under medical care, but he hasn't got a grave, and he's commemorated on the Lone Pine Memorial. So again, just because you're under medical care doesn't always guarantee that you will have a grave.
The question has to be asked, Pete: how do you lose a colonel? The colonel's been wounded. He's in the field hospital, and then he dies of his wounds, and yet his body's not been discovered.
I think it's an indication, isn't it, of what happened after we withdrew. That grave markers were used for firewood, were burnt. Obviously, we know, and it's just one of those things. We know that some of their bodies were disturbed because the rumours for the local people that there was gold on some of the bodies and precious metals. So we know that some of them were exhumed. So I think it's just one of those things. Is that trying to sort out who was who when we returned after the war was very, very difficult.
It's a very good point. This is a great spot, Borchop's Hill, to get a view just of the mad tangle of gullies that the Anzacs had to advance through in that assault on the high ground. It's just insane. You can't quite believe it when you stand here, and you're standing now in the mouth of the valley and just looking up at, you can see the high ground very clearly in front of you, but just the complex tangle of gullies to get there, just extraordinary that they were expected to do that. But we're going to head back down the track now from Borchop's Hill. We're going to carry on, and then after about 650 metres, we're going to come to 7th Field Ambulance Cemetery. Now, again, an interesting, unsurprisingly, a field ambulance set up here and a cemetery made beside it. Interesting, this string of cemeteries, isn't it, Pete, all the way up to Suvla? Again, I think it reflects the isolation that rather than create one big cemetery and put them all in, it's just these isolated cemeteries all the way up this rutted track. And so they when they came back, they built 6 or 7 or 8 of these cemeteries.
Well, they almost mark the routes, don't they? They mark the routes from either of advance or from the front line moving back down to the beach, and they are all, again, mainly medical posts. These are all medical posts where we've discussed it earlier, where men are dying and they're needing to be buried. And you have to say, in this rugged landscape, I mean, the disposal, if you're going to use that rather horrific term, the disposal of bodies was difficult because the land was dry and hard, and and when you've got tired men who you need really to fight or need to do other things, to bring up water, to carry the wounded, digging graves mustn't have been a high priority, and yet it was, because the flies, the heat meant that men had to be buried very quickly. And so, again, I think that burying men quickly also means that not always marked so clearly, because it was just necessary to get them under the ground as fast as you possibly could.
And again, a big old cemetery, 640 graves, 276 unidentified, and 207 special memorials, as you say. This is an interesting one too, because this is a bit of a mixed bag of men that were killed in that assault on the high ground. So a lot of men from Britain, men from Australia, men from New Zealand, and men killed right up until the evacuation. So this cemetery, probably more than any other, is a good demonstration of of how this ground was used between August and the evacuation. The main reason we like to come to this cemetery is not actually for the cemetery, although I do spend some time there. The main reason I like to come to this cemetery is it's the starting point of a short little walk that we're going to do now, Pete, which really summarises the futility of this assault on the high ground on the August offensive. Because a short walk from this cemetery, if we head back south across the fields, we come to a little, I don't even know what to describe it, a little cutting between two hills. It's a little scrub-choked gully is probably the only way you could describe it. And you should overlook it. It should mean nothing. I mean, it should be absolutely pointless in the Gallipoli campaign, just one of thousands of little scrub-choked gullies. This one, though, is essential in the story of particularly the Australians and Colonel Monash and the story of the Australian advance on Hill 971, because the story was that the Australians left late. By the time they were all assembled at Anzac and began marching north for their attack on Hill 971, so they had to march up along the beach, then turn right, go up a valley and attack the high ground up Hill 971. They were very late. They all got bunched up. It took a long time for the columns to move through. And so because they were so late, their commanding, the commander of the column, who was Major Percy Overton, who was a New Zealander, he was worried that they were going to be very late in the assault on the high ground. And he had a guide with him, a Greek guide who had known the area before the war. And the Greek guide said, no, if you're trying to get to that high ground, no one bothers to go all the way north and then turn into the big valley, as the plan said. The guide said, we always take this little shortcut. There's a little gully that we sneak down and we can get there in half the time. And so, getting a bit desperate, not sure what to do, Overton listened to him and they decided to take this shortcut through this little gully called Taylor's Gap. Now, it might have been fine for the occasional Greek farmer with a donkey or two, but there were 3,000 men in the column. And you can't believe it when you see this gully. It is literally, imagine the most scrub-choked little washaway you've ever seen in your life. And 3,000 men had to barge their way through this gully. Eventually they found the going so tough they couldn't get through anymore, and pioneers had to be sent up with machetes to try and hack their way through. But just imagine. Pete, you've served. I've never had the honour of serving in the military, but you certainly have. How would 3,000 men in a column go, being sent down this scrub-choked little gully in the dark, most of the time they would have been stopped because they couldn't move forward, and then just moving forward in single file down this gully. What would that do to men when they're advancing for an attack before dawn?
Exhausting, mentally as well as physically, because you think, well, surely, you're not doing, you're only walking for a little while and stopping again, but it's just mentally and physically exhausting because you can't sit down, you have to keep standing, and standing still can be as exhausting as walking, especially if you're loaded. But the mental attitude, the mental kind of feeling of knowing that you had to be there on time, you didn't want to be caught in this gully, but in daylight, you had to get through it. And knowing that they must have been walking, well, two abreast at the best, but possibly one behind another, just horrendous. It was just truly horrendous. The chances of getting lost were minimal, but it's that mental knowing that you're going to be here if dawn breaks and you're still going to be in this gully, trying to get through this gully. And you can just imagine, the pioneers being sent forward, trying to get to the front of the column, bringing their axes and machetes and billhooks to try and cut their way through. And just stressful, just the whole experience stressful. And if you were commanding, or any kind of commander, whether it be a lieutenant colonel or just a sergeant in charge of a section, the stress on them as well, keeping their men occupied, keeping them together, keeping them quiet, because they're also trying not to make a lot of noise. Yeah, it's just one of your nightmares as a soldier, to find yourself stuck in a gully and trying to get through that gully before daybreak and getting to an attacking position. And also, you're going to be exhausted. One of the issues is, there's going to be no rest, there's going to be no lining out ready for the attack. You'll be exhausted as well. So, yeah, not good.
It's just the scale of the men as well. 3,000 men. We can't even quite get our heads around it. I mean, that's a rock concert you'd normally go to, or a sporting event. 3,000 men trying to squeeze through that space. It's unbelievable. So you can scramble up and look down on Taylor's Gap and try to imagine what was going on, which is very difficult to do. And if you're incredibly hardy, like you and I did, Pete, you can actually try and walk through it. And it's just a scrub choke today as it was back then. And I believe it's somewhere near here. Your glasses are still waiting for you to collect them, Pete. It's a tough slog, but you really should do it to understand just the challenge faced by the men. And the worst part of this whole little fiasco, Pete, is when they finally got through Taylor's Gap. So because it was a shortcut, they got disoriented in the dark. Overton, the Major Overton, the commanding officer, he got lost basically in the dark. And what they should have done is come out of Taylor's Gap and gone hard right into the valley that they were supposed to be walking along. But instead they didn't. They kept going. They walked straight across the gully they were supposed to walk across and ended up turning into the next one and didn't realise. So therefore, when they were sending reports back to Monash, their commander, to say where they were one valley too far to the north. So every time they climbed a spur and said, we're now going to begin our attack on the high ground, they were one spur too far north. When they said we can see a hill in front of us, it was a hill too far to the north. So Monash was trying to command in the dark his columns without even knowing exactly where they were. And as I said, it wasn't even until after the campaign he even knew. He sat down with a map and his staff, and they said, let's try and work out this mess of what went on. And by interviewing the soldiers, they discovered that they'd been on one ridge over from where they thought they'd been. Yeah. And he was quite horrified at the whole time, at the discovery. So, again, what a disaster.
Yeah.
So definitely when you're there, go and do Taylor's Gap, because it's just remarkable. It's a symbol of the disaster that was the August Offensive. And so, unsurprisingly, the Australians didn't get anywhere near Hill 971. They were stopped on the slopes by the Turks from very savage fighting and never got anywhere near Hill 971. But we're going to head back down to the road. We're going to continue north past another couple of low spots, Gem and Chillick Spur and a few other places that were famous in the fighting. But the site we really want to get to is the last stop on our tour, but it's a really important one, Pete. And I know that the first time I took you to Gallipoli, we had quite a fascinating time walking this ground. This is the battlefield of Hill 60.
Oh, Hill 60. One of my favourites. Yeah,
it's just remarkable. You can never. I mean, it's a hill really in name only. It's barely a little rise on the ground, but it was the key feature that linked Anzac and Suvla. The Turks occupied it after the August Offensive had died down. It was still occupied by the Turks, and so the Allies had a real problem that they occupied Suvla, they occupied Anzac, and the two were not linked. They were still held by the Turks. Yeah. So a few hardy riders used to try and make the mad dash to try and get between the two places, but they realised they had to clear the hill.
I'm just going to make an interesting little point here that I do on my tours. Hill 60 on the peninsula is 60 feet above sea level. Hill 60 on the Western Front is 60 metres above sea level. So just a snippet of useless information.
Well, it's not useless at all. It gives an indication that this hill is barely worthy of anyone that's been to Hill 60 in Belgium will note how high it is, famous for the mining that went under there, the movie Beneath Hill 60. Yeah. This little Hill 60 is barely a rise. If you could ride your push bike up it without changing gears, it's a low little hill. But so that was the situation. So the fighting at Suvla had died down. The British were hemmed in up there. The advance for Anzac hadn't worked, so the Anzacs were still hemmed in, although they had some new ground that they'd captured north of the sector. But right in the middle was Hill 60 occupied by the Turks. So they realised they had to clear that hill of Turks so they could link up the two sectors. So on the 21st of August, a very big attack, and effectively the last major assault. I know that on the same day, the British troops attacked at Scimitar Hill, Pete, in the nearby at Suvla, which was also a very large attack, one of the largest attacks, and also, really you could say that the last Allied offensives of the campaign took place on the 21st of August. And the attack on Hill 60 was mostly a light horse attack. Very interesting. We tend to only think about the light horse in places like the Neck. But it was basically a light horse attack where they swept in, they captured the Turkish trenches. But for days and days, some of the most brutal fighting of the campaign. It's an overused expression. I've used it a lot on these podcasts, but the fighting here was absolutely horrific. So mostly Australians and New Zealanders with some British troops. And this is a quote that I'm going to read now, Pete, from Captain Brian Cooper of the 5th Connaught Rangers. So he was British, and he fought in this area. And this is just a description of what it was like to fight here. So again and again, the Turks attacked, mad with fanaticism, shrieking at the top of their voices and calling on Allah. The merciless bombing continued, and the trenches slowly became encumbered with dead. At last, about 10:30 p.m, after the fight had lasted 5 hours, a crowd of Turks succeeded in entering the Rangers' trench near its northern extremity. This northern end was held by a small party of men who died where they stood. The remainder of the trench was, however, blocked, and further progress by the enemy arrested. Still the fight raged, and bombs and ammunition were running short while the losses became so heavy. Fresh Turkish attacks kept coming on, and for every assailant that was struck down, 2 more sprang up in his place. Just imagine the horror of that, Pete. And unsurprisingly, the Turks refer to Hill 60 as Bombasert, which means bomb hill, from the bombs that they threw. So we're talking, when we say bombs, we mean hand grenades here, and we're talking hand grenades, the famous Turkish cricket ball grenade with the fuse, and the Anzac jam tin bomb, just used just savagely here. And again, Pete, give us your perspective as a military man. What would it be like to be in these cramped trenches at night with these attacks and counterattacks going on?
Yeah, well, again, it's you've got to rely upon your friends, because that's why the camaraderie of the military is helpful here. You have to know the guy on the left is doing his job because you're just protecting your front, or you're fighting in your little bit of the trench. But it's very hard when you've got exploding bombs, which, even though they may not kill you, they shock you. And so they'll knock you over, they'll rattle your brain so that you're in a stupefied situation, and so you're relying on somebody else while you recover to protect you. So just horrendous close quarter fighting, and it is almost becomes medieval almost in its ferocity. And I know that when we were there, one of the things that we found all over Hill 60 were fragments of bombs. There were fragments of grenades, of those Turkish ball grenades, everywhere. And so it's still there. It's still in the landscape, this evidence of the ferocity of the fighting that took place on Hill 60. So an extraordinary place to visit, extraordinary place to read these accounts, and then to see the physical remnants in the landscape still. And I found it very moving when we were there.
I have them on my desk beside me, Pete. One of the most treasured artefacts I've ever found on a battlefield, but 3 pieces of a Turkish cricket ball grenade. Still with the curved surface. I think these are 3 pieces from the same grenade. I mean, they almost match together. Just extraordinary. They're probably not, but just that I found 3 pieces in quick succession, just in that area, in the area where so many grenades were thrown. Yeah. I love those links with that history. That finding bomb fragments on Bombasert was pretty remarkable. Just an extraordinary place to visit. We also found, Pete, I recall an Australian bullet, an Anzac bullet with the curved top. Which the actual projectile fired from a rifle, just a remarkable area. If you look behind the cemetery, there are still a number of trenches and you can see the site where the ferocious fighting went on. So the Anzacs didn't succeed in capturing the entire hill, but they got to the summit. They held off against those ferocious Turkish attacks. But one person that was very prominent was Second Lieutenant Hugo Throssell, one of the great tragedies of the war. Good old Hugo Throssell, the last Victoria Cross awarded to an Australian at Gallipoli. So he was instrumental in holding back the Turks during these counterattacks. So grenades were exploding all around him, and it was said that the men were inspired by his fiery valour and witty sallies. So fighting not only ferociously but with good humour. He was wounded several times by grenades and refused to leave the line while these men were still there fighting. At one stage, a grenade went off, and fragments of the grenade actually forced the medal shoulder title that said Australia into his shoulder through his tunic and into his shoulder. They removed it when they treated him in the field hospital later on. They had to pull it out of his shoulder with tweezers. But he refused to leave until his commanding officer came along and saw him all bloodied and bandaged and ordered him out of the line. And he left the line and then collapsed and was taken to the field hospital and treated and was invalided back to Australia. He was so badly wounded, so never returned to Gallipoli. However, did successfully lobby to be returned and served in Palestine in 1917. Served in 1917 and 1918 with his mates from the Light Horse. So a remarkable story, awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. But just a tragedy, again, the tragedy of the First World War. He was from Western Australia. His father had actually been the Premier of Western Australia at the turn of the century. So he's from quite a distinguished family. His brother had been killed during the war, and he always struggled with his war wounds. Poor old Hugo Throssell. He was always in immense pain from his wounds. He never really recovered, and he was a bit of a shell of a man. On 19 November 1933, he sat down on the veranda of his farm and shot himself. Committed suicide. He was 49. So again, the tragedy of the First World War that echoed for decades afterwards. I always feel so sorry for Hugo Throssell and that story, but he went from greatness, having won the VC, to that sad end on his balcony in Western Australia.
I don't think he actually ever came to terms with the loss of his brother either. I think that was difficult for him as well. There's a very good book about him. I'm afraid I can't remember who the author is, but there's an excellent book about him. I've got it somewhere on my bookshelf behind me.
It's just a remarkable place, Hill 60. I mean, we sound like we're lingering here, but you should linger when you walk. And
yeah, I agree.
The cemetery is fascinating. It's just a place of such immense grief. It feels like it, doesn't it? But you go up there and it's sort of pine trees looming over you and the wind whispering through the trees. It feels ominous. It's there are ghosts all around you up there, and it's quite an awful place. And the cemetery is picturesque, but feels awful as well, especially when you know what goes on around there. The cemetery is built on the side of those trenches. Many of the men are still buried in the trenches where they fell. So today, 788 burials, 712 unidentified. So again, one of those massive cemeteries at Gallipoli with just a few headstones. So just absolutely should go there. Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, her uncle is buried there. He was killed in the fighting as well. And so he's buried there as well. So Helen Clark always had a very soft spot for Hill 60, and it's just one of those iconic places. I think we should leave it there, Pete. I think that's been a good walk through that north of Anzac sector, and next week we'll do the rest of Suvla as we head up. But just a remarkable little spot in Gallipoli that not a lot of people get to, Pete.
No, indeed not. Can I go for a dip now? I fancy a dip.
Especially if you've been here in August in the footsteps of the troops. It's just a remarkable place. So thank you for joining us on this walk through Gallipoli. We always love going and doing these more far-flung battlefields, and this is a very special one with some very special things that went on here. So we hope that you've enjoyed this. Hopefully you've been. Send us some notes through social media. Contact us and tell us if you've been. Have you been to Gallipoli? Have you been to the Suvla sector? Is it a place you're looking forward to going? I strongly recommend you go there whenever you go to Gallipoli. So it's thank you for joining us once again. Follow us on social media. Subscribe if you want to get extra content. And just thank you for following us. Pete, it's been wonderful as always. I look forward to your reports from the battlefields as you head off for Anzac Day, and for talking to you again in a couple of weeks, mate, when we do our next BattleWalks recording.
Yeah, look forward to it, Matt.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.